Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Scientia. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jim Pomerantz, Professor of Psychology and Director of Scientia, and this is our third lecture of the academic year in a series we hope and expect you will find engaging, perhaps a little bit unsettling, and difficult to forget. A series that's focusing on the theme of conflict, violence, and war. We're fortunate indeed to have a highly respected scholar who's new to Scientia and fairly new to the Rice faculty as our speaker today, and David Cook, whose topic could not be more relevant to the theme of Scientia this year and to the concerns that are foremost in our minds on a daily basis. So it'll be my pleasure to introduce David in just a moment. But first, let me remind you of the backdrop. Our theme of conflict, war, and violence was selected, as is always the case, each academic year by a group of Rice faculty members, headed this year by David Queller, who is somewhere in these lights. There he is over there. You can read more about this theme and more about Scientia in general, either on the program cards that Eldon Butler has set up down here in front or on our website. The program blurb, as we affectionately call it, describes our theme for this year as follows, by saying, the desire for peace and tranquility may run deep in the human spirit, but conflict, violence, and war have been nearly ubiquitous hallmarks of our past. This year's series will examine the nature and origins of violent conflict, not only in modern-day warfare and throughout human history, but in its evolutionary roots within other animal species, by examining a spectrum extending from the appearance of violence in images to the occurrence of competition versus cooperation in experimental gaming and bargaining situations. We will examine the causes and possible purposes of violent behavior, as well as what might be done to contain violence in the future. So far in our series this year, we've heard from a biologist, Joan Strassman, who showed us some memorable images of violence in animal species, and then we got to hear from Marty Weiner in history about the history of human warfare, and today we get to hear from David Cook from religious studies to talk about the concept of jihad from both the Muslim and non-Muslim viewpoints. My guess is that most people in this room did not have the word jihad in their vocabulary as recently as 5 years ago, but now it's entered our common vocabulary, so we have Fortune magazine saying the war against smoking has turned into a jihad against people who smoke. Probably few of us, even though we're using the word with some frequency, understand what it really means, so that's really part of the goal today. So following David's talk, we're going to have one more talk this semester by Rick Stoll from Political Science, who's over here, a friend and colleague. Then we'll be hearing from 4 speakers in the spring who we're in the process of lining up, but they include Kirsten Osher from English, Dave Schneider from Psychology, Rick Wilson from Political Science, and an outside speaker to deliver the Bachner lecture, Watch This Space. So David's going to follow the standard format of talking for about 50 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to question and answers from the floor, and that'll be followed by a wine and cheese reception right outside this room. So as for David Cook, David joined us 3 years ago and when he became an assistant professor of religious studies, just around the time of 9/11, as we were talking about. He's had a significant impact on our campus just in that short period of time. He received his bachelor's degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1994, and then his PhD from the University of Chicago just 2 years ago in 2002. Immediately before coming to Rice, he was awarded a fellowship at the Martin Mary Center at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Despite his recent vintage, he's had an incredibly productive scholarly career so far, with over 28 articles and reviews and chapters published, and over 7 encyclopedia articles, dozens of conference papers, lectures. He's frequently sought out by the news media. I think David's had over 25 interviews with the press just so far this year, and we still have a few more weeks to go. If you've not had a chance to meet David, I suggest you do that by going to see his office. I think he has perhaps the most remarkable office on the Rice University campus, and yes, I have seen Gilbert Cuthbertson's office. David's office rules. It's a thing of beauty. The walls solidly lined with beautifully done Islamic books. Would be a great cover for the Sallyport, I think. David's teaching focuses on the Quran, contemporary Islam, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, popular religion in the Near East, and most relevant to his talk today, a course called Jihad and the End of the World. Just last year, David received the 2003 Thomas Robbins Award for Excellence in the Study of New Religious Movements for an article entitled Suicide Attacks or Martyrdom Operations in Contemporary Jihad Literature. So as always, let me ask you to turn off your cell phones and pagers or anything else that beeps, lest we have a jihad directed against people who abuse cell phones, and tune in to David Cook, whose title is Does Jihad Mean Violence? David Cook.
This afternoon, I'd like to challenge us to examine this word that Jim has used with such fluency and in such a wide range of contexts, and consider it anew. Maybe I should best title my talk, Does Jihad Necessarily Mean Violence? And so let us consider, first of all, what we can learn from several different sources in the short period of time that we have to examine this subject. First of all, from a comparative point of view. Second of all, from a linguistic point of view. Third of all, from a religious point of view. And fourth of all, from a historical point of view. Each one of these areas is relevant to our discussion because, as always, with prominent religious concepts, there's a continual development and a continual reinterpretation that exemplifies the living tradition that is Islam. Now, first of all, as we start to look at jihad, obviously what we think of, most of us probably non-Muslim, most of us influenced by September 11th, we immediately think of violence. And it's to that end that I would like us to consider the broader connotations of this word. It goes without saying that religious violence is not something that is necessarily confined to the Islamic tradition. We have a wide range of examples of religious violence located in the Bible. I call to your attention Joshua chapter 11, Joshua chapter 10, where we find the beloved story of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still. And we find the words that God himself fought on behalf of Israel on this very day. Essentially, here we're talking about one of the predecessors of jihad. Again, from the more Christian side of the Bible, from Revelations 18 and 19, we find the picture of Jesus as a warrior coming back out of the clouds and so forth. And so, as we're looking at the larger religious tradition, as we're comparing Islam to it, we need to be aware of these other aspects of religious violence or God fighting on behalf of a certain community. Now, linguistically, as we're looking at the issue of jihad, the word comes from the Arabic root meaning to struggle. Now, from this very sense, we have our first hesitation, let's just put it this way, our first hesitation on the road to deciding whether jihad necessarily means violence. We have struggle that is religiously sanctioned, but not necessarily violent. For that, I'd like to cite a verse from the Quran, from Surah number 22, verse number 78, where it says, "And strive," meaning the word jahada, okay, "for Allah as you ought to strive. He elected you and did not impose upon you any hardship in religion, the faith of your father Abraham." Here, we see a very early sense of the word jihad that apparently is fairly divorced from any of its perhaps violent aspects. It is purely religious. Another verse from the Quran that gives us a similar early sense reads, "He who strives," again using the word jahada related to the word jihad, "only strives for himself. And those who believe and do the righteous deeds, we shall remit their sins and we shall reward them with the best of what they used to do. From Surah 27, verses 6 and 7. So, at a very early stage, the Quran seems to imply that the verb of jihad, the action of jihad, is a spiritual action in which one fully fulfills the requirements laid down by God. Now, one cannot deny, however, that there are other aspects of jihad or violence, whatever we want to say, inside the Quran. The Quran reflects early Muslim history, and we find that the last 10 years of the Prophet Muhammad's ministry, between 622 and 632, were usually characterized by warfare. And that is heavily reflected inside the Quran. Now, at this very early stage, however, we do not find the verb to strive necessarily connected with the fighting process. There are very many verses describing fighting, describing the process of taking prisoners, enjoining victory upon the Muslims, describing the idea of God fighting for the Muslims. But oddly enough, they are not necessarily connected to this term that later on has become so important in describing Muslim warfare. I would like to give you at least one of those, and since we'll have to refer to some of these things in the future. From Surah number 9, verse 111, we read, Allah has bought from the believers their lives and their wealth in return for paradise. They fight in the way of Allah, kill and are killed. This is a true promise from Him in the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran, and who fulfills His promise better than Allah? Rejoice then in the bargain that you have made with Him, for this is the great triumph. With this, we see a sense of redemptional jihad. Jihad as salvation. But the word jihad doesn't appear in the verse. So there's kind of a difference, a disconnect at this early stage of the Quran between the fighting process necessarily and jihad. So how did it come about that this word became so closely associated with what later we will call Muslim warfare? This is a process that is not easily disentangled from a historical point of view. And so we have to look at two of the other sources that I mentioned earlier on. First of all, Muslim history, and second of all, the early Muslim religious tradition. Now, after the time of the Prophet Muhammad, who died in 632, there was a mass expansion of Muslims throughout the area which we today call the Middle East. This was a process that later on became called jihad and is identified anachronistically by later books as jihad. And so it is seriously a problem for Muslims to deal with this particular aspect of the expansion of Islam. Okay, later on we'll find that jihad becomes to be something that is usually defensive in nature. But at this very early stage, it is still an offensive action that leads to the domination of Islam in the area of the Middle East. And this is reflected in the earliest books that we have of jihad. The first books that we have that start to appear at the end of the 9th century, the beginning of the 10th century, we find jihad described in a great many traditions, many narrations, descriptions of people who fought, and the beginnings of a sense of that. What is jihad? How do we define it? Where is it? What are its outer limits? How does God sanction it? What happens when the Muslims are defeated, and so forth? And so there's a strong sense, as we can find from other religious traditions, that God is fighting on the side of the Muslims, that these early conquests, this incredible expansion of Islam, is in fact the result of God's mandate and serves as something of an evidentiary miracle designed to demonstrate to the world the truth of Islam. From the earliest book that we have of jihad, that of Abdullah bin al-Mubarak, who died in 797, we read a certain tradition which I'd like to cite for you. It talks about 3 different categories of people who are killed, and it finally uses the word jihad. And these 3 people are interesting for our purposes. The first one we're not going to read, but I'll just summarize the verse, the tradition, where it talks about a believing man who strives, who fights in jihad, and is killed, and he enters heaven. This is a person about whom there can be no ambiguity. His actions merit heaven. His intentions are good. Now we have a second person who is quite interesting for our purposes. It said, a believer committing offenses and sins against himself, who struggles with himself and his possessions in the path of God, such that when he meets the enemy in battle, he fights until he is killed. This cleansing wipes away his offenses and his sins. Behold, the sword wipes away sins. So at this very early stage, we have an attitude of jihad as a salvational aspect. Now, this can be contested from other aspects of Islam, since Islam promotes salvation not necessarily coming from jihad. The vast majority of Muslims will probably find this such a tradition to be actually a little strange. But clearly, there were certain groups at this early stage of Islam that did promote the idea that that dying in jihad was actually a certain way to salvation. Now, as the conquests began to die out, as the Muslims began to dominate the area between Spain, North Africa, Central Asia, India, and so forth, this large area that forms still today the core of the Muslim world, Muslim legal experts began to look at the term jihad and try and define it. What on earth does it mean? How can we regulate it? And this is where we can kind of begin to see the beginnings of a clear definition that we can start to work with. Jihad as warfare that is mandated by God, but is closely regulated in nature, and has a number of set rules that cannot be broken merely to gain a certain advantage inside the warfare process. And so the legal experts identified a number of different types of jihad, and we have to consider those before we go on to answer our question: is jihad necessarily violence? One of those aspects was what they called jihad of the soul. Jihad of the soul implies, and as I sometimes also call jihad of the hand or of the sword, jihad of the soul implies that one is essentially dying in the process of the jihad, or that there is a fighting process to be had. Now, obviously, that's the type of jihad that many of us consider when we hear the word today. However, they also isolated several different other types of jihad. One was jihad of the tongue. Jihad of the tongue was the process by which a believer, a Muslim, confronted injustice and spoke out in a difficult or dangerous situation in which there was a possibility that he or she may actually have to pay the ultimate price. So here we see a different type of jihad, a not necessarily a violent type of jihad, but one that is very closely connected to the idea of justice. Now, for this, many Muslims would say that this brings out the aspect of justice that is implicit also inside the jihad of the sword. That justice stands behind the desire or necessity to fight a battle. That the Quran describes jihad as the process by which believers confront aggressively those who are in a tyrannical or oppressing situation on behalf of those who are being oppressed. And that is best brought out by the jihad of the tongue, in which one is not necessarily violent, but could have violence then practiced upon one's person. There is also a category called jihad of the heart. In other words, the desire to further justice, to confront the tyrannical rulers, tyrannical powers that be in a jihad, but perhaps not being able to actually do it. This brings us to the whole issue of intention. Intention is a key factor inside the correct waging of jihad. In other words, when we consider the salvational aspect of the tradition that I read to you a couple of minutes ago, we find that this intentionality, the person intends to gain some sort of salvation. He is seeking that aspect of salvation. The third person, I might add, which I forgot to read, who's described in this tradition, is one who goes into battle without that correct intention, who is essentially a hypocrite or a sinner, and he is sentenced to hell. So there's a very absolute and uncompromising attitude towards the correctness of intention with regard to the correct waging of jihad. The last type of jihad that was isolated by the legal experts was, in fact, jihad of what we might call resources, jihad of money. One can pay or supply money to worthy causes and thereby also wage jihad in a way that is acceptable to God. And so, to sum up for this particular legal discussion, we find that in actuality, no less than 2 out of the 3 legal categories isolated by legal experts, Muslim legal experts, actually do not necessarily involve any particular type of violence. Already, this hopefully gives us some pause in necessarily identifying jihad with violence. We have dealt with the salvational aspect of jihad. Jihad as salvation, dying in the process of battle, and thereby creating salvation for oneself. Now, this type of jihad, or this type of warfare, can we say, is known from other religious traditions. We find the figure of the martyr is so extremely important in Judaism, in Christianity, in Buddhism, and in many different other religious traditions, and that also in Islam, the figure of the martyr who is obtaining salvation by means of the witness that he or she is proclaiming through his own life. Now, this martyrdom can be achieved by a number of different methods. We can guess that a martyr who dies in the field of battle is one who obtains some salvation, according to the tradition and so forth. But we find a number of different other types of martyrdom are also available. In other words, I'll just read off a short tradition that covers some of these. We find that according to an early tradition, there are 7 types of martyrdom other than being killed in jihad. The one who dies of a plague, the one who drowns, the one who dies of a serious illness, the one who dies of a stomach complaint, the one who dies in a fire, the one who dies in a building collapse, and the woman who dies in childbirth. And so here we find a stark difference between those people who are obtaining salvation necessarily through the battle, the dying process, and those who are having violence inflicted upon them and are still yet considered to be martyrs. Another aspect of jihad that we need to consider is the very spiritual aspect of it. Jihad as a spiritual method of warfare. Now, it seems clear from the Quranic citations that we've read that jihad involves actually increasing one's spiritual activities. that jihad would represent that aspect of spirituality that presses onward, that struggles and seeks to obtain a deeper spiritual level than would otherwise be available to most Muslims. And that can be reflected both on the fighting side as well as perhaps other different aspects of the Muslim's life. But most commonly, it's associated with what came to be known as the greater jihad. Excuse me. This jihad relies upon a certain tradition in which we find that fighters came back from a certain raid to the Prophet's city of Medina, and they were told by the Prophet that they had returned from the lesser jihad, in other words, that jihad in which they were actually fighting with a sword, to the greater jihad. And upon asking what is the greater jihad, we learn that it is fighting one's evil or lower self, fighting those deeper evil sides of one's personality or characteristics. Now this brings out a larger picture of the word jihad. Jihad as dealing with cosmological forces. Cosmological forces meaning those of God versus Satan. And in other words, jihad is that aspect of fighting against one's evil inclinations, one's evil side. I'd like to read to you a little selection from the famous Sufi mystic Rumi from the 13th century, where he cites a certain character by the name of Ayadi, who had been a warrior. He says, Ayadi said, 90 times I came into battle unarmed. What he means by that is he was open to being killed, and that perchance I might be mortally wounded. He wanted martyrdom. And at the end, he was not granted martyrdom. And so he withdrew from the whole issue of battle. And he says, I threw myself into the greater warfare, which consists in practicing austerities and becoming lean. One day there reached my ear the sound of the drums of the holy warriors, for the hard-fighting army was on the march. So he is tempted, actually tempted to return back to the fighting process. And we see that that during the course of this spiritual discussion, he has to overcome his temptation to grab his sword and go out and fight and join these people, and that actually constitutes his victory in the process of the spiritual warfare. And so that at the end, he is able to gain the victory. As the soul says to him, he says, the soul says to him, here thou art killing me daily. Thou art putting my vital spirit on the rack, like the spirits of the infidel. No one is aware of my plight, how thou art killing me by keeping me without sleep and food. A strong sense of jihad as responding to the necessity to fight, combat sinful nature, the evil inclination of each person. Now, obviously, the whole issue of jihad, getting back to our central and core question of is jihad necessarily violent, is one of great sensitivity for Muslims. This has become apparent over the last 100 years, during the course of which we find numerous polemics, usually directed by Christian missionaries, against Islam, characterizing Islam as a religion of the sword, dominated by violence, converting infidels or non-Muslims at the threat of death. It goes without saying that for Muslims, this is a difficult accusation to answer. And therefore, there's a great deal of sensitivity and apologetics that have been built up around the whole question of, is jihad violent? Many Muslims feel today that to admit that jihad has some sort of element of violence in it may somehow or another compromise the reputation of Islam in the larger world, and therefore sometimes even can deny these aspects of conquest and other types of jihad. So we have to ask ourselves, is jihad necessarily violence? On the basis of this historical, religious, linguistic evidence, and come to some conclusions on the basis of which we can discuss it. First of all, we have to note one thing about the jihad literature, is that it does not take into account the other. It does not take into account the feelings or the responses of the other upon whom the Muslims are waging the jihad. Reading through book after book on Muslim jihad, we found virtually no affirmation that the other had a substantially legitimate point of view, or that their beliefs or merited some sort of consideration, or that they weren't worthy necessarily of being fought. And so this is a problematic issue, because as we look at jihad versus violence, obviously from certain points of view, from those non-Muslims who have been the recipients of various different types of jihad, it is violence. It must necessarily be violence because of the way the fighting process that is happening. Muslims, however, as they're looking at these types of jihad, oftentimes ask the question, is this, or is something like this, a legitimate jihad? As we look at Muslim history, oftentimes we say, any warfare that proceeds from Muslims must necessarily be jihad. And this is a difficult thing, because as we look at the way Muslims perceive jihad, they have very stringent rules concerning it. Not always do Muslims actually obey those rules. And therefore, many times those things that we perceive as violence proceeding from Muslims, from Muslim countries, or going back into history, finding various different responses or attacks, they would not be characterized by Muslims as legitimate jihad because of the fact that they did not adhere to those close rules that were laid down by the legal experts. So we need to be careful when we discuss this subject of not making sure not to label everything that happens in history or in the present necessarily as jihad. It is for Muslims to decide the meaning of this word and what exactly the type of warfare that can be accurately labeled as jihad, what exactly it is. And so, to date, there's been serious disagreements inside the Muslim community concerning this. So, when we get to the crux here, we have to ask, as far as is jihad necessarily violence? We can say, no, it is not necessarily violence. That overwhelmingly, it does not necessarily and completely overlap with all the different types of violence that can necessarily proceed from this particular religious or ethnic community. Other aspects must cover those definitions and so forth. Is it usually jihad? Now here we get into more tricky questions. So here we need to evaluate the relative weight that history places upon different types of jihad, and much more problematic and much more subjective. Obviously, we have a great many instances in which jihad is actually violent. So we look at these other different types of jihad, the jihad of the tongue, the jihad of resources, and we ask, is it likely that these were predominant in the overall field of jihad? We look at the greater jihad, the process of fighting against one's lower soul, and ask, did it predominate? And these are questions that still remain to be answered. And I will probably frustrate some of you by not actually answering them. But because we still lack those that critical research to know precisely what is the more predominant, what can be more attested historically, but also we also lack that moment in which we can say the Muslim community continues to be alive and continues to change and continues to develop the concept of jihad. And so ultimately, it will be the Muslim community that will bring about this type of change and decide what is the real type of jihad. Is it one type? Is it another? And so forth. Muslims might ask, to finish off here, what does it all matter? Is this really relevant to a non-Muslim? Or is this something that is just really an internal Muslim issue, trying to decide what is jihad here, what is jihad there? And obviously, since you've attended here, it can't be necessarily confined merely to Muslims, because Muslims have an effect upon the outside world. And to a large degree, that effect, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, is going to be classified as jihad. Now, Muslims can say that is an unfair characterization, and in that case, they may have justice on their side. Nonetheless, it is incumbent upon Muslims, obviously, during these trying times of where jihad is used frequently by any malcontent. Osama bin Laden can say that he proclaims a jihad, and does anybody stand up against him? We have to ask this as non-Muslims. So it's necessary for the Muslim community to define what is jihad and to stand clearly by a definition. So that would be what I would like to say about jihad, and I intended to open it up for questions, since I know that there will be a substantial number of questions here for this.
Let's just stop for a moment and give you
Okay.
We have microphones here, not necessarily that your voices aren't loud enough for the rest of us in the room to hear, but we need them for purposes of the tape recording for people who couldn't be here today. So if you've got a question, we already have Sherry Rauch over here with question number one. Be raising your hand and getting Dick Randy or my attention in between questions so that we can be ready to go with the next one.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you could say more about whether there's a criterion or an institution that decides of a given thing whether it counts as a legitimate jihad. I wonder if you could say more.
Okay, one of the issues of Islam is the fact that there is no hierarchy dealing with these sort of questions. Now, in general, Muslims have dealt with this problem by reaching some sort of a consensus after the fact. But this consensus can sometimes be extremely slow in being achieved. And so there is no hierarchy that can proclaim jihad, which means that effectively anybody can, and is a serious problem. Is a serious problem because many Muslims don't want to associate themselves with jihads that are proclaimed by malcontents or people that are off to the side. So.
Is there any substantial difference in the understanding of jihad between the Shiite and the Sunni and some of the more radical, like the Wahhabism?
Yeah, there's a substantial difference between jihad, Sunni jihad and Shiite jihad in the fact that Sunni jihad is usually directed towards non-Muslims, whereas Shiite jihad is usually directed towards Muslims. Shiite constitute a substantial minority of the Muslim world, and therefore jihad that they initiate is usually directed against Muslims. As far as Wahhabis go, in general, they have also directed most of their jihad against Muslims as well. So.
Can you help me understand this a little better by comparing or contrasting this with a notion like crusade?
Good. Okay, excellent. To have to deal with the crusade, obviously the concept of jihad and crusade are oftentimes brought together, and they are oftentimes analyzed together by scholars. Now, one of the aspects of crusade that's so important is that hierarchical sense, the proclamation on the basis of the papal authority, whereas the jihad is more of a response. The jihad that was established against the Crusaders, for example, never had a formal proclamation in the same way as Pope Urban did in his famous peroration at Clermont. Muslims do not like to have the crusade compared to jihad. But as far as scholars go, there are numerous comparisons to be made. The divine nature of the combat, the idea that God is behind or is sanctioning a certain thing, the messianic nature that oftentimes accompanies it, and different other the religious aspect of the warfare that's being laid down that is so clear inside the First Crusade, even though there are definitely exceptions. So I don't think that necessarily we can say that jihad is a crusade. I prefer to define it as religiously mandated warfare that is regulated. But then that kind of avoids the whole issue of, is it comparable? But yeah.
Oh, over here. I was sort of interested in the jihad of resources. In our legal code, if you pay for someone else to commit a crime, if you take out a hit on someone, then you're also prosecuted for that. What's sort of the relation of paying for violence or paying for something like that sort of in the Muslim or in the legal codes of the countries that are mainly Muslim?
Well, okay. I mean, first of all, this is not something that's specified in contemporary legal codes. But you find it in classical literature a lot. Excuse me. A lot of times people did not want to fight, and so they would pay other people to take their place. Now, this is a problematic issue as far as jihad goes, because the essential spiritual nature of it should accrue then to the person who paid, as you pointed out. But yet that person is not putting their life on the line. And so there are numerous legal discussions about this particular process and the ways that it can be abused and sometimes was. In the end, the person who is paid does not gain that spiritual aspect, even if that person actually ends up dying. Now, that cannot be, there's no legal codes that deal with that in contemporary Islam, contemporary Islamic states, because the whole notion of jihad is not something that's pushed by any of these states in any way. So,
is there anything to suggest that, if you trace Islam back as far as you can, that the idea of jihad was more of a way of describing a value of ultimate sacrifice or just sacrifice in general, and then over the years that's been corrupted by essentially man using it to motivate or to, call upon it's people. I mean, I feel like a lot of things in religion are corrupted by culture and man over the years, where if you take it back, maybe it was once just a symbol of sacrifice or something of a higher value.
it's possible. I mean, it's possible. I don't consider it necessarily to be probable. I mean, you'd have to. It depends on your reading of the different verses, that some of which I cited from the Quran. The problem is the word jihad in the Quran, as I said, is not used in the way that it later became popular in Islam. And so the words describing fighting, or what we would today call jihad, perhaps, are not those that are used inside the Quran. And so, yeah, so you have those few evidences of striving for spiritual benefit on the one hand, but you also have then that development of the warfare aspect. As to whether that's been corrupted, I would say that there's a probability that it has been. I mean, it was clear that this is a very popular call throughout Muslim history, and therefore highly open to manipulation. And so, but documenting it would be very difficult and somewhat subjective. So.
The first time I ever heard the word jihad that I can recall was when it was used against Salman Rushdie. My question is not, is it used often against a single person? And when the Ayatollah called for that, did other Ayatollahs join in, or did they continue their separate ways?
I've never heard the word jihad used against Salman Rushdie at all. Yeah, in all honesty, I've never heard that. As far as the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, it was issued only by Ayatollah Khomeini, and it was not necessarily supported by the other religious leadership in Iran. It's usually seen today as an attempt by Ayatollah Khomeini to gain or regain political ascendancy that he had lost to some degree by stopping the war against Iraq prematurely. So that's the way it's usually seen or interpreted today.
Other questions?
I think you should wait for a microphone.
Do the Muslims consider struggles between the two factions as jihads?
That's an excellent question, and obviously highly problematic, because they label them frequently as jihads. The question is whether something like that, something inter-Muslim, can really be legitimately called a jihad according to the classical rules. Now, the legitimacy behind that is the idea that one side that we would call Muslim is not really Muslim. Okay, and so for an outsider, this quickly becomes impossible. I don't decide who is a Muslim or who is not a Muslim. As far as I'm concerned, anybody who calls themselves a Muslim is a Muslim, unless there's really very seriously good reasons to place them outside the bounds of classical Islam. So, but yes, you find frequently that that differing religious factions will attempt to call religious-based violence jihad and gain legitimacy thereby. So that continues the process of degradation that the previous questioner was talking about. That to the point where I've posited in my book that maybe the word jihad today has no further meaning. That it really, I mean, you cannot define it when anybody can proclaim a jihad, when there don't seem to be any adherence to the ancient rules, and when so oftentimes the goal is simply to dominate another Muslim religious group. So,
can you call off a jihad?
Can you call off a jihad?
Cancel it.
Yeah, there's processes that was asked by different legal experts. You know, what happens when the Muslims are losing? Okay, there's an assumption behind the jihad laws that God is on the side of the Muslims and therefore they will win. But that assumption is not necessarily borne out by history. And so there are processes by which a jihad can be brought to an end. There's no particular person that can call for that, but it just kind of happens. So,
my question kind of refers back to what you just said about your book and how you speculate in your book that the term jihad has very limited value, or might possibly have very limited value for contemporary discussions. And I guess I'm wondering if you could expand on that by answering the question, how relevant to our contemporary understanding of violence, particularly in the Middle East but also elsewhere, is an understanding of historical, linguistic, and religious meanings of jihad. And if that's not the right framework in which to analyze this kind of violence, then what is?
Good. Okay. When I said that there's no further relevance, I should clarify that there's relevance, maybe I should say residual relevance. Not so much as actual relevance. I would say that there still remains some power to the call for jihad, both on the part of Muslims who sometimes still respond. So there's clearly some audience that is responding to a call to jihad. And there's also a great deal of influence on the part of non-Muslims, for whom the call to jihad provokes a great deal of fear and oftentimes prejudice against Muslims. And so in that context, there is necessity to continue to use those ancient terms, even though I am forced to say that I think that they're gradually losing their coherence. Now, as to how on earth we can come up with some new frameworks, I think that probably we would need to focus more on the pure ontological violence and its opposite, and on how those categories are going to be gradually redefined, because Muslims are aware of the fact, very well aware of the fact, that jihad has serious problems. And so I trust that within the following years that there will be serious discussions by Muslim intellectuals, by Muslim religious figures and so forth, trying to decide that. And I think that we're seeing that actually right now, as there's been protests among Muslim liberals about the excessive use of jihad against Americans in Iraq, for example. Calls for jihad, what does that mean? What right does somebody like Sheikh Qardawi have to say that there's a jihad against the Americans? I mean, inside the Iraqi newspapers, they refute those things. And so there is, I think, a beginnings of serious discussion on the part of Muslims. What on earth does this have any relevance? And should we try for new categories? So,
yeah. In your talk, you mentioned a distinction between a kind of defensive jihad or an offensive jihad, and I was wondering whether there's any moral difference between these two, and if so, I mean, in contemporary jihad, are they mostly staged as defensive jihad or as offensive jihad?
Okay, with the exception of the major Muslim conquests of the 7th and 8th century, more or less, most jihads have been portrayed as being defensive. And really, when you come right down to it, that's the only one that you have to say was pretty much offensive. Okay, the nature of the expansion, the breadth of it, pretty much precludes anything else. But now, definitely, Muslims will portray just about, I mean, since jihad is pretty much confined to radical Muslims don't have any trouble seeing their jihads as defensive. They see the world as encroaching upon them, as having deliberately provoked them, occupied their countries and so forth, economically, culturally, and so forth, dominating them. They don't have any trouble spinning that as being defensive jihad. And so, in general, they tend to avoid, I mean, there's certain ones of them that will just say, well, we need to conquer the world. But really, for the vast majority, even radical Muslims will tend to avoid using the idea of offensive jihad. So.
In your talk, you said the definition of jihad was a religiously mandated war that is regulated. Mm-hmm. How is it regulated? What do you mean by that, and who does that regulation?
Okay, the process of regulation was the Sharia, the divine law, which is a culmination of discussions by Muslim legal experts, have laid down numerous laws about what constitutes jihad and what does not. And so these will be divided up into categories. How can the war be fought? What elements of war are not permissible? Okay, can one, for example, I mean, there's all sorts of different discussions about it. Can you torture a prisoner? How much torture are you allowed? Can you mutilate bodies? what people can be taken prisoner, what people cannot be taken prisoner, how much can they be ransomed for. All of those, I mean, they'll go on and on of all these different discussions and so forth. And so what I meant by closely regulated is those regulations constitute the legal basis, the legitimacy of the process, and create something of a, I mean, it isn't just a mass of people, you know, a berserker gang going in and murdering and raping or something like that. It is a process that, at least according to the legal text, can be broken and must be abided by. That's what I meant.
How was the so-called offensive jihad in the 7th and 8th century explained through the geopolitical context of that time in the writings of classical Muslim scholars?
Well, classical Muslims did not need to really explain it. I mean, for them it was an evidentiary miracle. The idea that a group of people from Arabia could take over the Middle East was an amazing fact. I mean, for them, that constituted proof that God was on their side. Excuse me. And so they didn't really need to explain it in other ways than that. It was the defeated peoples that needed to explain it. And so you find numerous Christian apocalypses and other different interpretations from that time that try and explain why on earth this group of Muslims have all of a sudden come to dominate the world. So today, it's more problematic because most Muslim religious thinkers are try and conceive of jihad in purely defensive terms. And in order to do that, they have to explain away how did the great Muslim conquest actually happen defensively. Okay? And so sometimes that strains all credulity. So I've given a number of examples of that in my book. So, but anyway, yeah. So I mean, there's no real need. Does that answer your question there? Yeah.
To bring the concept of jihad up to the present, I would like to propose a hypothetical poll of believing Muslims and asking them the question: did the thousands that died in Fallujah recently go to heaven? So that what would they answer to that? Would most of them say yes, that was a jihad, or would they say no?
Muslims are so variated. I don't know that anybody can possibly answer that. I mean, it really just depends on where you are asking that, who you're. I mean, is it an Arab population? Is it a Turkish population? Is it an Indonesian population? It's very hard to get to. Muslims just cannot be easily categorized. There are all sorts of Muslims. I mean, I think that on the balance, probably most would say that they went to heaven, because you don't just generally, in classical Islam and contemporary Islam, you don't generally consign people who otherwise are Muslims to hell without a very good reason. But it might vary significantly from place to place, so there's just really no way to know. Yeah. Unless you did the poll. And doing polls in third world countries is a challenge.
Where's Bob Stein when you need him?
Any other questions? If not, David, thank you for a fascinating talk.